Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We are going to get started. It is just after 1 o'clock. My name is Ian Campbell, Vice President of Operations at PACICC. I am the staff lead for the Risk Officers Forum, and I'm your moderator for this afternoon's broadcast. I want to thank my colleague, Danica Hall. He is working behind the scenes with the slides and just coordinating things so that the broadcast goes smoothly. This is our third and final webinar of 2023, and I want to thank people for joining us here today on a Friday. It's not as easy to get everybody out on a Friday, and a special welcome if this is your first webinar joining us. Danica, please put up the agenda. Thank you. We'll look at housekeeping items, and then I'm going to throw over to our CEO, Alistair Campbell, to introduce our speaker. He's going to issue some words of welcome and outline some of the progress made on some of the PACICC priorities. Get into a moderated discussion with our speaker, and then I'll take the mic back and we'll talk about our next event and close the broadcast with a reminder about our satisfaction survey. So in terms of housekeeping items, everyone is very familiar with the Teams platform. You can see on the top of your taskbar. We want a very interactive broadcast, so raise your hand if you have a question or a comment in real time. Don't necessarily wait till the end of the broadcast to issue your question or comment, because we want to deal with that in real time and make this conversational. The antitrust compliance, I have to give a message on that. The Competition Act is in full force throughout this broadcast. You are and remain full competitors throughout the broadcast. Our lawyer is very comfortable. The meeting is being recorded. For those not able to join us here today, they'll be able to pull that up online. And now I will throw things over to our President and CEO, Alistair Campbell. He is going to welcome you here today and also, again, outline some of the progress made on PACICC priorities, and then get right into a moderated discussion with Johnson. Over to you, Alistair.
Great, Ian, thanks so much, and happy Friday, everyone. We're broadcasting from Vancouver today, having spent a portion of this week in amazingly sunny British Columbia, at a conference of the International Forum of things like PACICC, and as always, kind of eager to exchange kind of best practice with some of the amazing organizations that manage insurance failure in different parts of the world. Quick PACICC updates. The most important topic is just to confirm that over the course of the summer, we did a full consultation survey with the industry with regard to possible changes to our coverage and benefits. We received fantastically strong levels of response from the vast majority of the industry, and we will be taking some final recommendations from that consultation exercise to our board on November 16th. Most notable, we did ask in the survey whether there was some logic to perhaps introducing inflators into our benefit limits, so that it wasn't kind of a every 5-year spike adjustment, at least for personal lines maybe. And we thought it would be an interesting discussion topic. It turned out to have kind of landslide support for both personal property and personal auto. So our board will be taking a look at some options about how to implement some form of inflator adjustment in the model for PACICC benefit limits going forward, and updates on all of that to follow. One other item I did want to tease out, you will learn more about this when you attend our November Risk Officers Forum, but we published our latest Why Insurers Fail publication in our research series. Grant Kelly led a project to try and build a database, a catalog of insurance company failure around the world, and identified 457 insurers, or no, 547, there we are, insurers that have failed just since 2000. In 55 jurisdictions around the world, including many developed nations. I guess the key point being that while we have been blessed by a period of calm in the Canadian market, there's lots of other places on earth where insurers are failing. And it's a healthy reminder that during periods of peace, it's better to plan for something less peaceful. which is, I think, probably a nice segue to our special guest star for today. So, Jonathan, if you're there and want to throw on your camera, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Jonathan Miller to you here, Senior Fellow and Director, Foreign Affairs, National Defense and National Security at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. For full disclosure purposes, I will flag that my wife is actually on the board of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and as a result, she has achieved something I'm incredibly jealous of. She's on a list of those sanctioned by Vladimir Putin. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute has done outstanding work thinking about Canada's place in the world, and that has led to some friction with Russia under its current leadership. So I think that's just another credit to them. Jonathan's bio is available to you, so I won't bore you except to say that he represents a kind of a singular level of expertise on parts of the planet that Canada needs to really fully engage with these days. And so maybe just a couple of thoughts, and then I do want to have Jonathan kind of set the table for the discussion we will have. I think as Canadians, we tend to think of ourselves as universally beloved. We're a peaceful nation, we're a friendly nation, and everybody in the world obviously must like us. And over the last few years, we, I think, have discovered that the world is a more complicated and fraught place than that. Obviously, the tensions that led to a land war in Europe, Russia, Ukraine, was sobering, but so was the Two Michaels issue, and the tensions now clearly magnifying still in the relationship between Canada and the huge economy of China. Most recently, the tensions with India, another massive trading partner for us and the largest population in the world now. And even more recently, of course, the atrocities in Israel, the attack by Hamas, and the consequences for that as they now are going to work their way through the Middle East and the rest of the planet, where Canada is of a view, and I think quite a united one, but it will have consequences. So it is hard to think of a time in our lifetimes where geopolitical risk actually needs to show up on the risk register of every insurer, because it's going to have an impact on our commercial clients. And so what are the implications of this, and how should Canada be thinking about this? We thought would be a particularly meaningful topic to introduce into the agenda in our emerging risk seminar series. So with that as kind of setting of the table, my pleasure to hand the mic over, Jonathan, to you. Why don't you give us some introductory comments as you wish, and then let's start the conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Alistair, both Alistair and Ian for arranging this. And I promise not to, well, I can't promise this actually, but I hope not to depress everybody on a Friday with all the doom and gloom. But I think there are some of the issues that you've highlighted, Alistair, deserve urgent attention. And let me sort of start out with this sort of point. And again, I promise there will be some optimism later in my talk, but I just returned back from NATO's eastern flank. I was in Latvia, where Canada has its largest military mission, obviously bolstering our eastern flank allies amidst Russia revisionist aggression that we see in Ukraine. I attend a lot of these security forums, whether they're in Europe or in Asia. There hasn't been a period in the last 10 to 15 years where I've seen such a sobering period from a lot of officials as I've seen this past fall. I don't want to over dramatize this moment, but I've heard from several people that whether it's the tensions obviously in the Middle East, Alistair, as you mentioned, with Hamas's brutal terrorist attack against the state of Israel, whether it's the largest land war that we've seen in Europe since World War II, with Russia's illegal and unprovoked reinvasion, I should say, of Ukraine in February 2022, or whether it's the potentially much more consequential actions that are happening in the Indo-Pacific with with a resurgent and revisionist China across many fronts. I think that we are at a period that we have not seen since the mid-1930s. And I don't say that with a lack of seriousness and a lack of thought on this. I think the geopolitical tensions, the arms races that we're seeing, and frankly, the risk tolerance of states, what they're willing to do internationally and from a military force perspective that they were not willing to do 10 to 15 years ago is worth taking significant note at. And I'll give you a couple data points to point to this. So, of course, all of us see the largest data point is Russia's war against Ukraine, but a few that maybe might slide under the surface that you haven't thought about, but states that are taking much more reckless or risk-taking adventurism that they would not have taken potentially 20 years ago, when there was the thought of the unipolar moment, when the Americans post-Cold War could come in and the international system was there to restrain those who were willing to take adventurous tactics. One example I'll point to is in the Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, a long-running conflict where the movements recently by Azerbaijan basically came unchallenged. Even Russia, which portrayed itself as an ally to Armenia, wasn't willing to intervene. The international community wasn't willing to intervene. Other examples of this we see in sub-Saharan Africa. We've had coups across the board, whether it's in Mali, Burkina Faso, Gabon. We have tensions in Nigeria, etc. No one is willing to come in and take a stand or take a meaningful approach there from an international community perspective. And then we throw into that some of the large-scale tensions that we see across the region in the Indo-Pacific. The same week that we're grappling with the tensions in the Middle East, we've seen Chinese Coast Guard ships, which I often remind folks are not our grandmother and grandfather's Coast Guard vessels. These are massive, essentially gray hull naval vessels, which are painted white and are quote unquote Coast Guard. One of the Coast Guard vessels rammed a Filipino ship, which was trying to resupply one of the atolls there that international law says does not belong to China. But China said, effectively, we don't care. So the reason I'm referencing is we are getting back to this Bismarckian period of might makes right. And those states that are the most powerful will use an a la carte version of international law and basically effectively do what they want to do, what is in their interests, unless someone shows that they are willing to step in and intervene. And we're coming to this moment, I think, as Canadians, especially, who feel so tethered to the multilateral system, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's NATO or other organizations, that we feel there's always a multilateral solution to every problem in the world. But unfortunately, we realize that many states don't recognize this. Frankly, they don't recognize the value of international law, and they're recognizing the importance of power and might rather than the idealisms of the post-World War II system. So these are the hard, cold facts, the hard, cold reality that I think we're in across these streams. Within that, I'm going to talk about three sort of mini points and then sort of get into the so what for Canada before passing it back to you, Alistair. Three things that sort of keep me up at night, or large things that I'm worried about, both in the short term, but definitely in the long term. The first of it is not just China generally and some of the issues I've talked about, of course, the growth in their military program, the growth in their nuclear program, which I think doesn't get enough attention. There's a significant growth in the size and scope and modernization of their military program, which I think should be keeping people worried from deterrence perspectives. But I actually worry about the Chinese economy. I think this is not getting nearly enough attention as it should. We've seen increased centralization under Xi Jinping. One of my colleagues calls what's happening right now in China the Putinization of Xi and the Kremlinization of the Chinese Communist Party. And what essentially that means is that the Chinese Communist Party, while it never was one that was modern and focused on liberalism as much as we all would have hoped it, it's becoming increasingly autocratic, increasingly focused on a cult of the personality, and some of the tactics it's taking, even economically, are of course driving away investors, are focusing more and more on the power of the state-owned enterprises, and looking at the heavy-handedness of forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, and also flat out espionage in order to achieve its economic dominance in the region. But this dominance is being challenged as we see its over focus on property assets, the property bubble that we see in China, in addition to the one main leverage point that the West holds on China economically is technology. High and sensitive technology effectively is one of the gasolines that runs the Chinese export-driven economy, and the export controls that the United States has put in, first under the Trump administration, but the Biden administration has not relented on this, have put immense economic pressures on the Chinese economic system that I don't think we've fully seen the result of yet. So this is one sort of bookmark I'd like to put in there, is the economic challenges that we probably don't see today, but under the covers are currently existing in China, is one that we need to be deeply thinking about it from a risk perspective. The official statistics of what China says their growth, their growth slowdown. Of course, several years ago they were talking about 8-9%, and now they're talking more about 4 or 5%. I think many analysts think that even that is extremely inflated, and that we could be looking more in the 2.5 to 4%. These have significant, profound implications for all of us who have premised ourselves on the idea that the Chinese, especially, and the Chinese economy, is going to be the locus point for international growth going forward. And my last point on this on the economic side is that this is not just a China issue. The supply chains that connect throughout the Indo-Pacific are all reliant on that same assumption of Chinese growth. So whether it's some of our partners in the region, Japan, South Korea, of course, the future and growth of the ASEAN economic community, in addition to India, is also premised, at least partially, in the success of the Chinese economy. So I think that's the first point to mention on the economy. The second one I think is more strategic in nature, and I want to use this symbolism. I wish I had the photo or the video to show you here. But last week, when China hosted its Belt and Road Forum, so the Belt and Road being this large infrastructure initiative that China has had for 10 years now, about spreading infrastructure projects around the world, especially in South Asia and linking up into Central Asia through to Europe. China hosted its 10-year anniversary conference last week, at the same time that we had meetings between EU officials and Washington. The symbolism I found was very interesting. You had the NATO Plus group with the Americans and the Europeans and Japan and South Korea on one side, and then you have 150 countries attending at various levels here in Beijing. You had Xi Jinping from China as the host, Vladimir Putin right beside him. They opened 2 large doors in Beijing and sort of walk in with this strut, basically saying to the world that times have changed, and this is the new world order that we intend to impose on you. Whether we want to accept that, whether we want to believe that, we can talk about the fractures and challenges both within China and Russia, but there is a defined push from a number of states to align themselves much more closely, and that rationale is precisely against the interests and the values that many of us have fought for so many years. So I think one of the takeaways for the Canadian audience here is to simply recognize that, to recognize this is not just something we laugh about and say, well, aren't they a bunch of funny autocrats and, they're destined for failure. We hope that's the case. But if we don't take active countermeasures and actually work towards our own resilience, we could have the destiny that we want to avoid. So I think that's the second point that I wanted to make. Now, Alistair, before turning it back to you, I want to talk a little bit about where Canada fits into this and how, with this, if I'm right on this mid-1930s moment, and I really hope I'm not, as a father and as one who cares about the future of democracy and our alliances, but I do feel that the complacency, not just in Canada, but more broadly in the West, we see, for example, our European friends in the midst of an active war, I hear these discussions in Berlin, and you're no more than a 2-hour flight over to Kyiv, and the complacency you still see at this point, over a year into this reinvasion, I find very startling. I find defense production stocks, for example, to supply our Ukrainian friends remain non-existent. we don't have the ability to help backlog this conflict even for another 3 months, let alone another year or two. And then we have the seriousness politically to think about how do we look forward as not only as an alliance in Europe, but moreover as an alliance of democracies to push back against some of these trends. I think we haven't fully thought through that. From the Canadian side, I think there's a complacency, whether it's on defense spending, but more broadly, I think our place in the world. I often think about when I was a kid growing up, seeing the heritage commercials that we would see on TV, on CBC, and it had this mythical image that Canadians attached ourselves to, that effectively we could do good around the world through peacekeeping operations, through other sort of forms of diplomacy. But essentially, the existential challenges of the world would not affect us, that we were protected under our Fortress North America, with our economic and security engagements with the United States. What I have been arguing for several years, and I think is becoming more apparent, is that sort of quarantined view of the world. It didn't exist in the 60s and the 70s, even though we like to feel like it did. It definitely doesn't exist in the 2020s. These challenges are apt to hit you on a random Tuesday, on a random Thursday, whether it's through some of the diaspora issues we have in our own country, or whether it's some of the interests that we find overseas with our partners. And the last sort of note I'll leave you on this is, I think the issue that will finally wake up the Canadian side, unfortunately, will be an existential conflict that we cannot avoid. And that likely will take place in the Indo-Pacific, and that will be one that would involve the United States and China. Imagine you're in the shoes of the Canadian Prime Minister, be it in 5 years, be it in 10 years, be it in 15 years, and we find that our American neighbor is involved in a kinetic conflict with People's Republic of China. Imagine at that same point that you go down to the Oval Office and try to explain to the American president at the time that rhetorically we're with you, but otherwise, good luck. To me, effectively, that's an unthinkable option. And I don't think that the Canadian side has really assessed the real potential that this could be one of our future scenarios in the next 5 to 10 years. It could be in the next couple of years. But I think we're woefully unprepared on a range of levels: civil society resilience, defense production, economic security, critical infrastructure, for us to really to understand that scenario. So I haven't had the optimism yet. It's been very depressing, but Alistair, maybe you can bring out some optimism through your moderated discussion.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And I think before we get to the good news, maybe just to tease out your thoughts on a couple more of the curveballs we've seen recently. So when our Prime Minister suddenly publicly in the House of Commons announces that there is compelling evidence, to him at least, though we haven't seen it, regarding the direct engagement of the senior leadership of Democratic trading partner in India, murdering a Canadian citizen, and the extremely fraught diplomatic consequences of that, in terms of effectively the expulsion of 41 members of the Canadian diplomatic service from India, and kind of the freeze up of visa granting for Canadians seeking access to travel there, etc. So maybe you could just give us your quick take on the India situation, because given the severity of the list we're already dealing with, this was a really untimely development.
Yeah, I think it is as well. So I have a couple thoughts on this. So I think first, the context is important, more broadly to our, our efforts with India and our efforts with the region. So again, put yourself in the context of just less than a year ago, and I think probably it was late November, just before December, first week of December, Canada released its Indo-Pacific strategy, so its approach for a more robust engagement in this part of the world. Even that, and I had been arguing for several years when I was in government, and then as the sort of the pest outside of government, that Canada should get more serious about Asia. The process to even develop that strategy, which was released last November, was painstakingly long, longer than it needed to be. Last in the G7 to have a strategy out, Finally, we got one out in November. Less than a year into that strategy, the largest country in the region, the largest democracy, not only in the region, but in the world, soon to be the third largest economy in the world, we come out with this sort of accusation. A couple points on it related to it. Of course, we all understand that, you know, extrajudicial killings, whether it's in Canada or anywhere in a democracy, is unacceptable. That caveat, of course, comes out there. But on my mind, when the Prime Minister made this accusation was, especially after reading his words himself, why would you go in front of Parliament unless you were 150% sure? To make a country lose face, a country like India, which is a prideful country, not a perfect country, and not a perfect government at the time. There are skeletons in the closet that absolutely need to be addressed. But to think of the rationale without having that smoking gun, so to say, in intelligence terms, of 150% certainty, credible allegations of potential links, I think was what was referenced in this speech. I see that, to be honest, as diplomatic malpractice. I'm not trying to absolve India of anything if there were wrongdoings, and potentially there very much likely is solid intelligence, but solid intelligence is not criminal evidence, and there's an active investigation, you know, being played out here. So I think it actually hinders the work of law enforcement and other things, in addition to being a very big diplomatic dust-up. My last sort of note on this is that since that incident happened, I've had several discussions with our allies, both here in Ottawa and overseas, and I think the same message comes from many, is that, you know, number one, why did you react in this way? We're not saying that it's something you shouldn't investigate, but the idea that we're going to have many rally to our sides, I think we're realizing it's a very, very quiet room, and effectively we're alone on this issue.
Yeah, so the idea that we're alone in the world all of a sudden on key issues like this is very sobering. Let's try the other gloomy category first, and then we'll see a little bit more about what can be done about it all. But the Middle East, you know, the Middle East and crisis tend to be words that go together. But it's been a while since we've had a really substantial crisis there. We're having one again. There's always a short-term positive impact for Canada, which is oil prices go up, and you can certainly see that playing out already. But this one seems to have kind of a scope and scale to it that could expand in ways that also have an impact for our working relationship with other nations on the earth. What's your quick take on that?
Well, I think, I mean, again, similar to a very different issue, but some similarities to our response on India. I think one of the challenges that, I mean, again, not just this Canadian government, although this one may at this point be at a stage where their fatigue level has gone to the max. But we have this sense that we can be friends with everyone and that we can release statements and processes that will please everyone. And I think fundamentally that can be, there can be errors with that. So one example I will put out, and I understand this is you know, a hot issue, but the very tragic attack on the hospital in Gaza. I think we came out very quickly, of course, rightfully, to say that the loss of life is horrible, but we veered on a territory where we were thinking about ascribing attribution to this potentially to the Israelis, and I think we jumped very quickly on this. The eventual backtracking of it came on a Saturday at 11 p.m. from a minister, not from the Prime Minister. The reason I use this reference is not taking sides on this issue, but I'm saying words matter, the way that you approach things matter. And I think there's a sense that on certain issues, and especially on this issue, we haven't been as strident as we could be. And again, it tilts this idea that we can be everything to all people. The last thing I'll note on the Middle East is that I think that we need to be thinking about this more broadly. The Middle East is a large place. There are a lot of different players here. Dynamics are fluid and changing at a quick pace. So for us to distill this into one issue, for example, some of the changes that are happening in the Gulf, the Abraham Accords, et cetera, there are shifts happening in the region that this will be I don't want to call it a hiccup. It's a very, very significant thing that's happening right now, but we can never take away the agency of individual states there. There are interests and directions that I think are shifting in the Middle East that I think Canada has sort of ignored, especially for the last 5 to 10 years, where many of our partners have not. The Americans, I think, have invested more into this. Even India, as we talked about before, has built up quite strategic relations, not only with Israel, but also at the United Arab Emirates and others, and has a number of strategic projects that link South Asia through to the Gulf, through to Israel. So I think not only from the national security lens, but I think from the economic lens, we're missing links because of the sort of old lens in which we view, and the sort of singular lens in which we often view the Middle East, rather than seeing these interconnections. And last point on this is that this has become a playground that also is being manipulated by other great powers and adversarial powers. So Iran, of course, being the #1 power, we see, we see obviously the relationship with Hamas. We know the relationship with Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon. But we also see the Russians and the Chinese playing significantly on this. I thought it was interesting to see how both China and Russia have reacted to the terrorist attack by Hamas, and their ability to bog the Americans down again in another theater, precisely because they don't want the Americans to be beefing up their commitments, be it in the Indo-Pacific on the Chinese side, or of course helping the Ukrainians in the transatlantic sphere. So there's interest at all levels here in the Middle East, and I think Canada has thus far failed to sort of appreciate all of those.
So when the world becomes more conflict oriented, and as we've just talked through, Canada has now got some defined, I don't know, enemies, I guess, or at least clearly not friends. It becomes more important to make sure you know who your friends are. But in that context, Canada's also got some issues. I think we've taken some comfort in being part of the Five Eyes partnership of the leading democratic nations, and we've recently seen some things where suddenly it's just the four of them and we're left out even of that table. And then, of course, if we're going to have issues with China and India, we realize that once again we need to double down on the relationship we have with America, our largest trading partner and our geographic neighbor. And even that has got some tensions and issues these days. What can you tell us about our working relationship with the good guys, if you will?
Well, that's a really good point. I actually think this should be the 4-alarm fire, or the red light that's signaling in Ottawa. I mean, our adversaries will be adversaries, and they're being more adventurous, and that's a huge challenge, as I mentioned at the onset. But the bigger worry, and I think the larger disappointment that we've seen, especially in recent years, is our lack of credibility as an ally. So it's not comfortable as a Canadian to go into these rooms, and publicly people will say that people love Canadians. They'll, they're happy to, to talk about hockey and other things. But privately, I always say there's the public forum discussion and the whiskey bar discussion. The whiskey bar discussion is not comfortable. You have some of your allies calling out, whether it's on defense spending, whether it's on the timeliness of hard-nosed diplomacy, whether it's on some of the economic investments, partnerships, et cetera. This is true in the Five Eyes. I think this was true when, for example, the Australians, the UK, and the Americans formed this AUKUS arrangement. So effectively carving 3 of the Five Eyes out. And yes, it's focused on nuclear powered submarines, but it's bigger than that. It's a bigger security intelligence, the future of defense and security intelligence, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, all of the next direction on where the security intelligence field will go is now centered in a trilateral partnership. So a tier 1, so to say, of the Five Eyes, Canada not included with that. And I should note, my last point in the Five Eyes is now we have a new government in New Zealand who's actually more forward leaning on this too. So as much as I love our Kiwi partners, using them as the barometer for where we should be on security intelligence issues probably isn't the accurate measuring stick. But now even they are higher in the good graces of the top tier of the Five Eyes in Canada. So that should be very alarming. Another example I'll put to you is on the Gaza incident and Hamas's terrorist attack, the so-called Quint, which is, many of us, the first time we even heard of this terminology, effectively was the G7 minus Canada and Japan coming out with statements about the terrorist attack. The Canadian side will say, well, no, we have our own dialogues, but we effectively were sidelined. And the Japanese don't have the same stakes as many of the European players on this. So us not being included on this, I think, was very intentional and very representative of the credibility that we have here. And the last point I'll mention is NATO. We still set at about 1.3% of GDP for defense spending. And I'll give you a personal anecdote. I was in Vilnius in Lithuania for the NATO summit this past July. Our prime minister was there to speak at one of the public forums that I was attending. And I remember there was the first one of the morning. We had 4 other heads of state there on the panel too. 5 minutes go by, empty chair. 10 minutes go by, empty chair. Where's the Canadian Prime Minister? He just wasn't there. He eventually showed up 12 minutes into the panel and sat down and made his comments. So I wanted to get a bit of the backstory for this, and I knew the Lithuanian counterparts very well. Apparently, he showed up backstage 5 minutes late, and they were profusely sweating and saying, "Okay, you got to get on the stage. We have other world leaders there. The program's already started." And he said, can I have an espresso? I'd like to just sit down and relax a little bit. And to me, that tells me something. That lack of seriousness with all the issues going on right now. The Ukrainians fighting for their lives, NATO under a fundamental existential crisis. The fact that we just are not a serious nation on these issues right now. I hate to say it, but I think that's the biggest reflection that shows that.
So, I'm not sure that this is a partisan issue either. So if I think about the last 25 years of not achieving the defense spending target of our NATO commitment, that's something that we didn't achieve under Harper any more than we've achieved under Trudeau. And so I guess from a practical perspective, if I'm thinking as a Canadian on a Friday afternoon with the sun shining here, what are the things that as a nation we need to start doing that this rapidly shifting geopolitical framework of thinking is going to force us to do anyway, but we should probably do it proactively than reactively? What would be your checklist of things Canada needs to do differently, regardless of which party's in power?
Well, that's a great question, and I know, and I'm happy that you brought this in on the partisan thing, because I 100% agree, and I have very deep worries about the next government, regardless of which party. I think this is something that it perhaps has gotten worse at this point in time, but has been longstanding with multiple parties in Canada, is the lack of attention, of seriousness on foreign and security issues, the lack of attention on things happening more broadly globally. And it's something that I think, regardless if we have the next party is a continuation of what we have now, or it's a new party in power, it's going to be a challenge. It won't be easy. And I think the overarching cloud here too is that economically there is not infinite money. Even though we feel like we can print it constantly, we are under some serious economic challenges here in Canada and globally. And the idea of putting more money towards defense or towards any of these issues that will require a sustained resource, it's a hard sell. I think we're going to be seeing this dollar in, dollar out sort of mentality, and we need many, many dollars in. And I'm sure there's dollars that can be taken out of certain projects and programs, but it won't be easy. So I think that's the first thing to mention, is that I don't have large expectations that this will change significantly just because we have a change in political party. I hope that I'm wrong, but I think that some of those structural issues will take time. What we can do, I think, as Canadians to change this, I think the first thing is just the culture and narrative that we talk about these things. So, I mean, frankly, even having this discussion today is an important way of thinking about how business links into this. I think we need to get ourselves out of the mindset that foreign affairs issues or national security issues are the remit of a handful of folks in Ottawa and their counterparts overseas, and the idea of really making this a national narrative and discussion. In Europe, we've seen this happen, especially after the war in Ukraine. Many of our European friends weren't thinking about global peace and conflict as hard as that is to believe with all of their history in the 20th century. But the war really woke them up. And this has become a part of the national narrative and discussion is the future of the global order. I still think that it's a luxury item status in Canada. You look at the last federal election, for example, there was one question, there was no foreign policy debate at all, but there was one question in one of the debates that I think was on China, but it clearly is not registering as an issue more broadly. So I think this is something that is not just on the backs of the politicians, but I think more broadly, the way that we approach this in media, the way that we approach this even in our education systems is looking the fact that what happens globally does matter significantly for Canada, whether it's our businesses, whether it's our government as well. So I think that's the overarching take. From a more granular take, I think we need to be thinking about the bifurcation of trade and investment and national security, and the fact that that bifurcation probably never existed fully, and that those fields are becoming muddier and muddier. That doesn't mean we shouldn't aggressively look at trade opportunities and take on risk when necessary. But I think it's important for both sides to have a much more smoother communication between the national security establishment in Canada and the private sector to understand, hey, where are these economic security risks coming from? What are the potential risks, for example, on forced technology transfer, et cetera? It's not just a China problem, although China is one of the largest challenges. So I think that sort of collaboration between the national security community and the business and trade community, I think would be important.
Very helpful. Thank you. So I'm definitely open to continuing to interrogate Jonathan on my own here, but I would flag for the folks in the audience that if they do have a question, they can just raise their hand using the Teams function or type a question in the chat, and we can make this a more interactive dialogue. But while I'm waiting to see if there are any of those, this is a group of chief risk officers who are thinking about how to think about different emerging risks and how they could impact the strategy and growth prospects of their own commercial insurance or personal lines insurance companies. So if you were to think about how geopolitical risk actually comes home to be something of impact for the Canadian economy, where are the places it's going to hit hardest, and who?
Great question. So, I mean, I think a couple of issues. I mean, when states have limited resources to act, some things have to be pushed to the side. And I think one of the challenges of the geopolitical competition, which will face Canada, our interests are global in nature, our business interests are global in nature. I put climate change as a massive one. And it seems like a cop-out and an easy one to talk about, but when states are focused on their hard-nosed competition and traditional territorial issues, sovereignty issues, arms buildup, there's less attention to global issues and things that they should be working on. So an example I'll give you is the two states that really need to coordinate and collaborate on climate issues are the United States and China. But China effectively looks at climate security and climate issues as something that, as a branch to give to the Americans if the Americans are willing to compromise or talk on other things, such as their role in Taiwan or regional security issues. So I see this as a massive issue. The fact that we will have stagnation on real multilateral cooperation on climate, and this will affect Canadian interests. This will absolutely affect our business interests. In addition to our national interests, if we don't push it forward. So that's sort of one I would throw at you. There's many others as well, but I see there's some questions too.
Yeah, I think Zara Partan is asking a little bit about, we saw this quite significant evolution in the new budget announcing a broadened mandate for OSFI, for Supervisor of Prudential Oversight Financial Services. It's suddenly given a new mandate around integrity and security, which implies that the government was definitely seeing a risk to our financial services system that needed more oversight. That was coming from foreign state actors. Do you have any insight you can share on that with us and how it might connect to our industry?
Well, that's great. I'm not too familiar exactly with that update, but I think it's a good example of how whether it's international actors who are putting pressure on this, and the government is forced to take some responses to it. So if this is something, whether other international actors have certain legislations or certain actions that have required us to rethink about the integrity of our own system, I think this is a clear example, but I'm not overly familiar with this particular article of legislation.
Yeah, well, I think the way to think about that that does poke directly against our industry is the degree to which increasing geopolitical tensions, you see people using cyber technology as another weapon. And whether that's just a kind of acceleration of denial of service attacks, all the way through to breaches and theft of intellectual property, all the way through to threats to our infrastructure. Would it be fair to assume that, because we do insure against cyber exposures, it's a growing line of business for our industry and a very important risk for our clients. What are we seeing in this kind of increased geopolitically tense environment on the cyber side of things? Can you offer us anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple elements here, and I mean, number one, we don't really have a legal construct internationally to govern some of the escalations and of cyber conflict, of whether it's state-based. The other thing is the blurring of the lines. I mean, what's being directed by hacktivists, by private sector actors, how much of it is connected to the state. So I think that it's growing at pace, and I think again this goes to the risk tolerance scale. Is that if something is in your face, kinetic, you can look at it through satellites. Whether it's military is moving in somewhere, it has a very different sort of impact and feeling than if it's done on cyber. So we've seen, and I've been noticing this, quite a higher uptick, and not just from a few actors, from several actors internationally, of utilizing their cyber means to attract a number of different objectives. Some of them are national security, some of them are economic espionage, some of them are denial of service if they're unhappy. I mean, we've seen this in the Canadian side from Indian activists even. There's been a high uptick since the accusation, as you mentioned earlier, Alistair, of denial of service attacks, et cetera. So I think any range of potential issues and disputes could result in a wave of cyber attacks. And I think the resiliency of some of our systems really needs to be called into account. And the last point I'll mention on this is we are integrated in so many ways, especially from a telecoms and critical infrastructure perspective with the United States. And one of the quiet discussions the Americans have with us a lot is that they are deeply, deeply worried about this. They're worried about their own house and their infrastructure protection. But the connectivity with Canada and the fact that we're responsible largely for our own cybersecurity there is a concern, I think, for the Americans. Because of their own vulnerabilities because of that.
I've also assumed that some of the more kind of malevolent state actors, I would include North Korea, Iran, and Russia in that, are actually using ransomware attacks as a generator of cash when they're facing such severe economic sanctions from the developed world. And I have to assume that only gets more of it's a more urgent issue. They need more cash. And so if we're offering cyber insurance to small, medium, and larger Canadian businesses, they're more likely to be victims of ransomware attacks in the next 12 months than they were the previous 12 months, I'm assuming. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair assumption. And you're right. I mean, the growth in ransomware, I mean, it does take a relative level of expertise, but I mean, you can effectively create a unit, and I think the North Koreans have perfected this in many ways, a couple of units that can provide quite significant amounts of money and be very hard to combat for a very cheap price. So I think that you're going to see many people, I mean, the Russians or the North Koreans aren't the only ones to do that, but I think they've really perfected this as a model. You may see Russia doing more and more of it. Russia's been involved in it for a while, but I agree with you. This is going to be an increasing challenge. And I actually worry not just about the state-based actors, but I worry about more of the private sector focused actors who will look at the North Korean lesson and say, yes, they have a war chest behind them, but we could basically do this independently for our own private interests, just like states do it for their own interests. So the growth of private-based organized crime effectively is the only way I could frame it, to use ransomware as well is a huge concern.
You talked earlier about Fortress North America. And after 9/11, we discovered that when the fortress actually got attacked, the border between Canada and the US suddenly became less porous. And there was a risk we were actually outside the fortress. And we spent quite a few years kind of renegotiating the terms of our kind of operating relationship with our largest trading partner. And then under President Trump, we discovered that we had whole new tensions around renegotiation of NAFTA, and then obviously tensions around things like Keystone. We discovered that we just didn't have enough friends south of the border to get things done that we thought were in our economic interest, like a functioning pipeline to take our oil to market. So the next year is going to also have a lot of developments in America, and those probably have a greater short-term impact on economic circumstances and political circumstances in Canada. What's your take on what we face kind of geopolitically there?
I think that's the biggest question of the day, because I think, you know, we can talk about China, we can talk about Russia, you know, we can talk about Iran. And I don't want to overly dramatize on this, but I think what happens, it's not just next year. I mean, these are long-running trends in the United States, is something I think the Canadians, ironically, have not paid enough attention to. Congress is fractured as a euphemism. I mean, things are not getting done legislatively. I don't see that changing regardless of which party gets in power in 2024, whether it's a re-election of the Biden administration, whether it's a new Democrat, whether it's Trump, whether it's Republican. I think Congress and the Senate has been broken on many issues. I think even more worrying on the international front is the Americans are very, very divided. Obviously, they have their own economic straits and concerns, socioeconomic issues that they rightly should be focused on, but it's led to a real deep division. And I think, as many people might have seen Joe Biden's recent primetime address, some people will look at that and see that projected strength, and I think he tried as hard as he could to sell a message. But I see it, you know, as an act of desperation, and I don't say that to criticize him, but I say that he sees Congress not able to do anything with this significant war happening in Europe, tensions in the Middle East, strategic competition with China, the world at a very, very fragile point. And America seems to be retrenching on many fronts. So I think that this is the big question for Canada. We cannot change that equation. We cannot, as much as we may try to. But I think for number one, for us to recognize that this is a reality, and for us to do everything in our power to ensure that as an ally, we're doing the things that at least we can do. And that's, I think, what we've been focused on, whether it's on energy security, whether it's on defense spending, whether it's on trade issues. You know, we don't have to do things for the Americans, but there are ways that we can be a better partner, a better ally, and see that relationship in a global sense. So I think if I was a Canadian official ahead of 2024, these things should have happened years ago, but I would be having a crisis plan of saying, what can I be doing right now before that election to make sure that, in January 2025, the trip to Ottawa is not one of accusations and threats, and one more of positive words, because I think we are not ready for that storm that could be coming in 2025.
So, and again, and I think you made this point, it's not that partisan a situation there either, in the sense that we are exposed regardless of whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. Even the degree to which we've ended up in a incredibly expensive bidding war to compete with the Biden administration's plan with regard to electric batteries, and the scope and scale of the multi-billion-dollar payments that we've had to make to companies like Volkswagen or Stellantis or whatever, just to have them continue to consider Canada as a place to install their next factory. Those costs are increasing because of the Biden administration's strategy. So I think folks just assuming that Trump bad, Biden good is much too narrow a way of thinking about Canada's interests inside a North American fortress, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, one of the speeches that sort of left me thinking about this was Biden's own national security advisor, who I saw at Vilnius as well. And when he made his speech, that he wasn't pointing out Canada, but he said effectively allies who are stepping up to the plate will be recognized publicly, and those who are not will be publicly recognized as well. So the Americans, I think, aren't playing around anymore, is basically what I'm trying to say. It doesn't matter if this is Democrat, Republican, if this is Donald Trump or Joe Biden or someone else. These issues are becoming serious for the United States. They have their own domestic issues. And I think the idea that we can slip by in the crowd and hope no one notices us, which has been effectively our foreign policy for several decades across many parties, it's not going to cut the mustard anymore. And I think that's the reality that we need to understand ahead of the election.
Let's see if we can get a little bit more granular about where the impacts are. I'm thinking about how big a country we are geographically, and so we have different economic resources to trade with in different parts of Canada. So if I'm thinking about, what's happening in the geopolitical world and how it's going to impact Canada, is it going to be easier or harder for Ontario or Atlantic Canada or Quebec or Alberta or BC? Is there any way for me to think about how these risks visit themselves geographically in Canada?
I think so. I mean, I think there's a positive news out of this. We promised we get to positivity, and I think that you think about our comparative advantage, and I mean, the challenge will be using our comparative advantage. So I mean, Canada, again, I think of many countries around the world who will look at us geographically and economically and be like, wow, wouldn't I love to trade places with you? You're in an amazing spot. I mean, 3 oceans, resources blessed, agriculturally blessed. So I think in the energy sector, critical mineral sector, agriculture and agriculture future sector, mining, and I mean, geographically, this is spread out too. I mean, I think we have, often you think about out west, some of these resources, but I think we have these resources in Atlantic Canada as well, Newfoundland and offshore in Nova Scotia as well. I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I think the challenge will be to be thinking about this in a long-term lens. So I think, to use one point of when the German chancellor visited and talked about LNG terminals, for example, on the Atlantic side, and there was the retort that, there's not a business case for it. Well, there may not be a business case in, 3 to 5 years, but it's premised on the idea that the world will at least not get worse in that point in time, and energy security flows will not get worse. I mean, I have news for those who have that optimism. I actually think that things will get worse. And the idea of Canada as a credible energy supplier, while still, of course, recognizing and looking towards transitions and working actively with allies on renewable energies as well, is one way that we could really benefit and across regions. And I do think on the ag side as well, I think that we're realizing food security is one of the most fundamental issues that it promotes conflict, that sustains conflict, is being leveraged in conflict, as we see with Russia attacking grain supplies, for example, out of Ukraine. Canada has an ability to help feed the world. Can't do it by itself, but we have the ability to ramp that up, to utilize that, and to be a good ally to our Asian partners and also to those in Europe. So I think those are two sectors that I think about, but I think there's many others too.
So, and I guess just to tease out how I watched that flow happen and your thoughts about it. We had this attack on the Ukraine. Germany discovers, having not thought strategically about their geopolitical environment in a while, and discovered that they had an existential threat because they had overexposed their energy reliance on a dictatorship that suddenly goes to war. And so they very quickly came to Canada and asked for help on the LNG side of things. And our prime minister basically said no. And so that was, I think, driven by a climate change lens, and maybe was not thinking as broadly and holistically about geopolitical risk and Canada's place in the world, in a world where there's conflict at such scale. Was that kind of a symbolic error, given the new world framework that you see?
I think so. I mean, I think a lot of it is about effectively reading the room. So realizing, of course, the situation that Germany and other allies are in. Of course, you could say that the Germans put themselves in that situation as well. I mean, I often feel when I think about Germany and their vision, of course, post-World War, and especially into the 70s and 80s, was premised on three ideas. I mean, number one, cheap gas from Russia and energy security from Russia, especially in recent years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Manufacturing in China, so building up their economic exports to China, especially their automotive industries, and then the U.S. alliance as their security guarantee. Two of those legs have basically fallen out. The Russian energy security was gone. China, they're clinging to the idea that potentially the Chinese economy link can still be there. Although I think a lot of Germans are realizing, with the American pressure on high tech and everything else economically de-risking from China, that side is falling out. And then you have the U.S. alliance side, where Donald Trump was threatening to pull out of NATO. Again, I don't see that happening in 2025, even if there is a Republican administration. But the Germans have made bad choices. But then you get to the Canadian perspective, to your question about reading the room, and we just haven't read the seriousness of how a lot of our allies see this issue. Japanese Prime Minister came shortly after the Chancellor and also had similar asks and said the same thing. And if you look at the position of a country like Japan, surrounded by Russia in the north, you have North Korea to the west, you have China, which is their largest strategic competitor there as well, and also a country that is not blessed with energy supplies, nor is South Korea, which is another ally that wants a sustainable energy. So I think, if we want to say that we have big partnerships in this region, that we're a critical player, what they really need and want from Canada is not the Royal Canadian Navy, but they probably want the Royal Canadian Energy Navy, a tangible way that Canada contribute to security of our allies. And I think that is in energy, that is in agriculture, and that is in other sectors.
So in a world of such tension, being as blessed as Canada is, there is actually decent prospects for better economic performance, just because the range of options that buyers have will be more constrained. And so we should see higher prices for grain, higher prices for oil, higher prices for the natural resources that we mine and export. In that context, if we play this right, the prospects are actually decent for our economic performance as a nation. Is that fair?
I think it's, yeah. So, again, without, looking at this too shrewdly, I actually think there's a lot of opportunity here. Of course, we can take principled stands, we can do our share, but I think you're right. If we choose to, I think many of the sectors, it can be a win-win scenario where we are helping the security and prosperity of many of our partners and allies, but also helping ourselves and helping Canadians, which are the bedrock of many of these sectors. So I think there is a way that we can look at this. And again, I go back to that scenario of many countries looking at Canada and saying, boy, like economically and in security terms, wouldn't I love to be in your shoes? Whereas I think often Canadians don't recognize that benefit.
And I guess to a certain extent, that's the consequence of being as blessed as we are, is that we can have the luxury of maybe not thinking about our risks in the same way. But I think that's true for many of the folks in this group. A chief risk officer has to keep amplifying the downside scenarios, as you've been doing for us this afternoon. And yet they will have constant battles with colleagues who are going, that can't happen, or it won't be that bad, or it won't happen to us. And so I guess I do see this topic as being quite a vivid example where you're not quite Cassandra, but you are a risk officer, kind of flagging that our nation is facing a threat matrix that's maybe more comprehensive and ugly than we're used to. And we actually need to be thinking about our contingency plans and thinking about our fallback options and thinking strategically about how to leverage threat and turn it into opportunity. So conscious of time here, what advice would you offer our risk officers about how to get a broader market to think strategically about risk?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, so again, I think one of the starting points is to have a bigger discussion, to have an interconnected discussion. It's easy to think about these things in isolation. One of the great things I've appreciated about this call is that we've weaved together some of the threads, whether it's things happening in the Middle East, things happening in the Indo-Pacific, things happening thematically, for example, on trade and investment, things happening on energy, is to realize that all of these things have interconnectedness, especially in the world that we have today. And I think this is the thing, whether when it's from a private sector perspective or a corporate perspective, is that something that happens in the Middle East may not appear to impact your interests, whether it's in China, but in reality, it actually does. Some of these supply chain risks are deeply interlinked. One thing that I find interesting to think about is that if we were to have, for example, full-blown contagion in the Middle East in a larger regional war, that would have direct, serious national security interests, of course, for the Indo-Pacific, which could then spiral into conflict there. Most of the countries there are fully reliant on energy resources from the Gulf. Don't have reliable suppliers like Canada, who could provide at least partial elements of that supply. So I think thinking more broadly about interconnecting some of these risk themes, I think, is really important, rather than sort of zeroing in, for example, on this specific incident or what China more broadly, what will China do for our risks? I think thinking about it in this interconnected manner has been a lot of fun for me, and happy to kind of keep the conversation going.
Well, and I guess the COVID experience gave us a pretty vivid taste of what the consequences of globalization of trade can have when the system suddenly gets plugged. And I think we noticed very quickly, personally, as families and in our communities, and also in business, how supply chain breakdown in a world of just-in-time inventory management really could kind of have impacts fast. I guess what you're kind of flagging here is that geopolitics could have a COVID-like impact on the way supply chains function. And we could be seeing a return to kind of COVID-like supply chain problems very rapidly in scenarios where things take a continued turn for the worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think just a quick point on this is that, and we saw this, and I don't want to make too many analogies to the world wars, but contagion tends to spread very quickly, and risk tolerance goes up very quickly when states realize that they can get away with it. So interests and cold hard interests have remained there. They've been latent. I think that there's been some successes, some significant successes, from the international community and institutions over the past, especially 70 years. But we shouldn't have that lull us to sleep to say these issues don't exist. So my biggest worry in the coming years is that one or two of these issues, and we're already seeing large examples with Russia's war in Ukraine and other issues, is that this could provide the opening for Pandora's box of many, many underlying issues that many of us are not even thinking about, that are still lingering, from the post-World War II period to pop out. And I just don't think that we're ready for it at this point in time.
It seems to be hard to argue with, I'm afraid. All right, so I'm just going to quickly canvass the room for other questions, conscious that it is a Friday afternoon. Is there anybody who has a question for Jonathan here before we wrap up? Please speak up, raise your hand, put it into chat. And I will just try one more kind of ranging question here, and then we can move to wrap up if we don't see any other questions. Jonathan, if you were to suggest two things that the Canadian government would need to do strategically to respond to the environment that you have described for us, two things that, regardless of party, our nation needs to do next to respond better to the threats and the opportunities, what would you put on that list?
Well, I would say the first thing, and again, this goes back to the national narrative, is that I think at the Prime Minister's level, we need a national address, like a Joe Biden address, but not done for the tactical purposes. I think Joe Biden, as I said, had to do this because he really needs to get money to the Ukrainians and others, and realizes Congress was broken. I think we need actually a national discussion. We need a FDR fireside chat, but we need that moment where the Prime Minister gets out to Canadians and says, look, I need 15 minutes of your time or 20 minutes of your time. We need a serious address about some of the challenges of the world. And it can't be a self-reflective mirror discussion where we just virtue signal and say, this is who we are. We have to actually have a real sobering discussion to say, the world is changing in ways that is not in our interests, is not in the interests of our allies, and we will need to do this, that, and that because of that. So I think that's the first step, is actually getting serious with ourselves, and that will require the highest level of leadership. And I can't remember, across parties when a prime minister has really done that, when the prime minister has gone out short of war and say, look, we are at a moment internationally where we still will live our lives and be happy and be prosperous, but we also have to recognize that we're at a pretty pivotal time. And the second one, I think, is enabling the positive parts of our ecosystem, especially in private sector. So whether it's on defense, whether it's on artificial intelligence, economic security, we actually have private sector that can help in this formula. So getting out of the way of our private sector and actually allowing them to help us on the modernization of our defense forces, the modernization of some of our economic partnerships with like-minded democracies on the emerging technology front, I think would be really a tangible way that we could move forward.
Thanks for that. I do see one hand, and it's our irreplaceable organizer, Danica. Where are these questions?
In the QA tab instead of the chat tab.
Cool. Let's take a look. We have a question from Sharon. What will those higher prices mean for inflation and interest rates in Canada? So that's the higher prices for our oil and our grain and our natural resources, I guess. And I think that's a super question. And as insurance people, we tend to think about interest rates pretty fast as we think about risks. Anything on that?
I think it's a really great question. And I mean, I wish myself, I personally knew what the future of interest rates were. But I think we all need to be worrying about it. I think that, number one, I think in Canada, as you probably all on this call know more than I do, we'll be closely watching what our neighbor to the south does. And I think that, I don't want to say we mimic entirely, but I think that we work very closely to see what the Fed does in the United States, and many of our G7 partners, maybe Japan being excluded from that, which has recently basically not budged much on interest rates in recent days. So I think, number one, I think we'll be watching closely to see what the Americans do in that. The interesting thing will be if, a lot of the reaction on interest rates and inflation, not all of it is related to Russia's war in Ukraine, but obviously there's a big significant element of that, and particularly the shortages on gas and challenges that many of our European friends would have. What happens when something else happens, or two things potentially happen while we still have a war in Ukraine? That's, I think, the thing that we should be thinking about with inflation and interest rates. For example, the nightmare scenario of a more broader Middle East war, where we have some of the energy supplies that are challenged, obviously from the Gulf region. Qatar, for example, which is a natural gas giant, is backfilling much of the supply that Russia provided for Europe. What happens if we can't rely on the supply from Qatar or from the Saudis or the Emiratis? You've seen this desperation, for example, with the Americans trying to smooth over sanctions with Venezuela. Why are they doing that? It's not because Venezuela is a benevolent regime. It's still a horrendous regime. It's because America's become realpolitik and realizing we don't have reliable energy sources. So, what happens in the future with that scenario of the Middle East having conflict, and then, God forbid, there being potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific? I think the interest rates and inflation question probably goes, if things maybe go through the roof and it becomes much more challenging.
Yeah, I guess I would have added on that that China, whose economic issues we raised at the start, looks like it might be actually entering a deflationary period. So there's probably some good news in terms of pricing and inflationary impacts as we see all the goods available from that market come down a little bit in price in this next period. But that's just so many moving parts, and you know that better than me. I am seeing another question here from Stuart that we missed from half an hour ago, which was on the same question around OSFI and its new guidelines around integrity and security. And you mentioned already that you weren't that familiar with that. I would probably flag for the MLI that, to the extent that our federal government has just introduced something meaningful, and as Stuart describes it here, probably global first, in terms of a regulatory guideline, it might be interesting to have your brains turn their attention to what are the implications of this and how could OSFI and the federal government get this right. That's exactly, and that's right in your bailiwick, I think.
I think it's great, yeah, and I'm definitely going to take that back. And I mean, especially the element of foreign interference on this too, because I mean, as we know, there's a broader inquiry that of all the things that are happening, we tend to forget it, but there's another inquiry that's happening now on specifically on electoral interference, but there's many different forms of foreign interference and foreign meddling, and I think that we're seeing it in this field as well. So I'm very happy to sort of bring this back and try to do more of a program here at the Institute on it.
Thank you. I think we have probably infected this room with enough gloom at this point, but also flagged that there are some things we could be doing that would put Canada in a better position than we are now to kind of manage the risks and seize the opportunities. So thank you, Jonathan, so much for your time and engagement today, and the fact that you've given us this extraordinary list of topics to consider as our risk officers are thinking about their risk registers and strategic plans for 2024. Sincerely appreciate your time today. Ian, back to you.
Very timely discussion. Thanks very much, Jonathan. And Alistair, thank you for asking questions that are top of mind for our members out there. And I think the lack of questions from the field kind of shows that you were hitting on the right themes that were already asked. That we do a biannual ERM survey. We conducted that over the summer, released results in September, and geopolitical risk made our long-term. We asked members what are risks you're worried about over the next 1 to 3 years and 3 to 7 years. And for the first time, geopolitical risk made the long-term risks, the ones that they're wary of 3 to 7 years out, as number 4. So very timely discussion. So thanks very much, both of you. The next event is our Risk Officers Forum meeting is coming up on September 30th, and Jonathan had noted about supply chain issues, and it's just nicely dovetails into our keynote speech there by Saad Murad from CEO and Chief Agent Zurich Canada. Look forward to that. And Steve Mallory, President and CEO for Directors Global Risk, is going to be talking to you about preparing your boards to oversee risk in the coming year as you pull together your strat plans and budgets for the coming year. That will be very timely and instructive. And finally, Grant Kelly, our colleagues here at PACICC, Grant Kelly and Judy Peng, are going to talk about the latest issue in our Why Insurers Fail series. They're going to be looking at when, where, and how often insurers fail, and the release of the global failed insurer catalog. So that should be very helpful as well. Very pleased to say as well that this is going to be a hybrid meeting. So there is an in-person and online element to this. And if you are able to join us in person, there is a social event taking place right after the meeting. So certainly added incentive to network with your colleagues for 90 minutes after the event. And we hope to see you in person for that. And what else do I have to tell you? I think that's it. Satisfaction survey to come very shortly after this. And I do apologize about the November 30th forum. We are going to be working with a technical advisor to beam this from the room and put it on Teams. So there were some hiccups with registration. There are some companies that had firewalls that prevented registration. So we banked your names. If you do have any questions or concerns that you aren't registered for the event, I'll be sending around a reminder, but do reach out to Danica and we will make sure that you are registered for the event. So our apologies with that hiccup with registration, but I think we've worked everything out and all as well. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on a Friday. Stay safe, happy Halloween, and we will look forward to seeing you in November. So thanks for being on board. Take care.